But the BBC needs to get its act together. We know what they're up to. We know what the education establishment are up to as well. Why are Scottish children not being informed of the harsh facts when it comes to Israeli atrocities? Why is the geography and history of Palestine so difficult to understand and being subverted by so-called intelligent journalists? Why is the BBC relying on games hosts and minor personalities with Zionist leanings to interpret not only what is happening in Palestine, but even interpreting what our government's line should be regarding Palestine? Maybe people are starting to put the pieces together themselves, and the Great Awakening to BBC BS is upon us. Maybe we can expect it from the London-centric BBC and right-wing sponsors of Murdoch's propaganda channels, but just to refresh people's memories and to make the points again for people's information, the following should help to put the facts in place of what's happening in Palestine and what has been happening for a long time, and Israel's real part in it.
Thanks everyone for coming out today. We've planned this informal gathering today in honour of the Nakba, and the Nakba was the catastrophe that befell the Palestinians when the State of Israel was declared in 1948, when over 750,000 Palestinians were displaced from their homes. And actually, although that is a significant event in itself, with endless brutality and people becoming refugees, the reality is that 73 years later, the Palestinians are still refugees in their own land and beyond. There's refugees in Lebanon who have never been given citizenship in Lebanon, who are struggling with the third and fourth generations of people who cannot get access to formal education and employment and are living in dire poverty. Throughout the past week, events have kind of overtaken us in terms of the fact that the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the holiest place for the Muslims to pray, the Palestinians gathered there during their holy month of Ramadan and were met with gunfire and brutality from the Israeli police inside the mosque itself. That has led to other confrontations. In East Jerusalem, the Palestinian communities that have been living there under the occupation since 1967, in the area of Sheikh Jarrah, were facing eviction. They've been trying to protect their homes at least for 2 generations, and they've now been told by the courts they can continue to live there until everybody dies, and then nobody will inherit their homes. The homes will go to Jewish nationalists, Jewish settlers who keep invading their homes and meeting their families with brutality. And as a result of the protests to these 2 particular events, rockets were fired from Gaza, and now we see that Gaza is once again under fire. Gaza's under the threat of massacre. This will be the 3rd period of massacre that Gaza will be placed under. The amount of rubble around Gaza is an absolute disgrace. Generations are living in what looks like a permanent bomb site, and Israel, at their whim, just drop bombs. We're facing the news of bombs going off and people dying at the moment as if that were new, but it's actually not new, because they practice their targets on Gaza on a regular basis, but with so few bombs, nobody ever puts it in the news, and the people are living in terror continually with drones running around their heads, letting the Israelis know where people are, what they're doing, and they have nowhere to go because Gaza has been under siege since 2006. I want to read out a statement from a good friend of mine who was born in Israel. which can't be with us today, and I'll read this out now. Back in 2001, when I began to make my first tentative steps towards Palestinian human rights, a common question I was asked was, why are you doing this? The reason I was asked this is because I'm originally from Israel. I was brought up in a secular Jewish Zionist family. I'm a granddaughter of Holocaust survivors on my mother's side, and I served my 2 years in the Israeli military when it was my turn to do so. I was asked why I was supporting the Palestinian people because back then, in Australia where I used to live, it was seen as somewhat unusual for a Jewish person, especially someone born and bred in Israel, to support the Palestinian people. I was not alone then, and I'm certainly not alone now. Over the past 2 decades, increasing numbers of Jewish and non-Jewish people have found the courage to speak out in defence of Palestinian human rights. But why do we need courage to speak out for our fellow human beings? Should we not all feel automatic compassion in response to suffering caused by avoidable injustice? Why does it take courage for anyone to experience empathy and do the right thing when human beings inflict injustice and abuse on other human beings? It should not require courage to stand up against injustice, abuse and suffering. It should be standard practice. It should be so standard to the point where injustice and abuse of human rights become extinct. But this is not where we are now. I was repeatedly asked why I was supporting the Palestinians because people assume that our loyalty to our group, our closer circle, should become more important before our compassion for others outside our group. Blood is thicker than water, we are told, and rarely does anyone question this. But if we think of ourselves as good people who care about others, this cannot be selective. Either we care about everyone, whomever they are, and stand with them where they are oppressed, or we delude ourselves about the kind of people we are. Selective compassion is not real compassion. Selective compassion is a form of collaboration with abuse, and it abandons victims to their suffering. Selective compassion helps keep bad situations bad and does nothing to change what is wrong in the world. Selective compassion keeps us divided. Israel is attacking Gaza yet again. Gaza, which is already the largest open-air prison in the world. Gaza, where people are living in horrendous deprivation of even the most basic necessities because Israel, aided and abetted by most of the world's nations and corporations, controls everything there. Everyone living in Gaza today is a descendant of the original refugees of the Nakba of 1947-48, who fled for their lives from the murderous forces of the Zionist Haganah. Their only crime for being trapped in Gaza is being Palestinian. When I was a child in Israel, the Hebrew phrase "go to Gaza," which we use regularly, was the equivalent of "go to hell." Gaza was already hell when I was a child, and it is far worse now, half a century later. While we watch Jewish colonists invade Palestinian homes in Jerusalem, dispossessing their owners in increasing brazenness and with impunity, they do so with the support of the Israeli government and with the police and military standing by and doing nothing or harassing and arresting Palestinians. There's a lot more that is going on in Palestine every day of the year that does not make it to a largely conservative pro-Israel media or public awareness. The trap has been closing in on the Palestinian people steadily and relentlessly, and the world does nothing useful. And I would like to thank Abigail Abarbanel for those words. Abigail Abarbanel lives in Scotland now and is a psychotherapist, trainer and consultant. Thank you very much. I'll pass you over to Basha.
In my old age, I need glasses. I can get them out. My name is Basha Gordon. I'm a teacher in Glasgow. And a few years back, I went over to the Kelvingrove Art Gallery Museum and I said, where is the Deir Yassin monument, the stone in Glasgow? And they said, we don't know anything about it. It doesn't exist. And what we have to do, it certainly does exist, it's here, and it's there to remember the Nakba of 1948, to remember the plight of Palestinians and how we are complicit in the crimes against Palestine as British, so far, nationals. We certainly are. And it's also to say that in 2017, the UN said in 2020 life in Gaza would be unsustainable. It is unsustainable with the genocide going on today. And this is a year later. Anyone with a heart must go out and find ways to support the Palestinians. I've written a few words. So, how many people today, unlike those across the road in the West, know about the Nakba, the start of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine 73 years ago, where the native population was expelled for Jews to come in throughout the world and take over and throw out the Palestinians, who would end their lives as refugees or not end their lives, would be killed. And I can tell you as a teacher that pupils in schools do not know much about the Nakba, and this is a definite policy by the Scottish Government, who have tried to silence us for 5 years to stop educational resources going into schools. Even education, and here's my colleagues, some colleagues are here, and we've tried our best to do this, to get them out, to be seen, but John Swinney, who is the Education Minister, although they were found to be robust, although they were found to be authentic and fit for purpose, has stopped them going to schools. Okay? My mother was educated under occupation in a different time, in a different country. She speaks now, only now in public, about her traumatic childhood. She remembers as a child being taught history by teachers who had two different versions. One version of history was for the occupational forces to hear, the other was in clandestinely to teach the children about their land and history. When a teacher was found to be doing the second version, they disappeared. Possibly to Siberia, who knows. No one knew where they went to, and everyone was afraid to ask. And we are now living in this culture of fear. I'm not saying that tomorrow I will be disappeared, but certainly I will be silenced, as everyone else will be who deigns to speak up for what is a crime against humanity. And I would say, when I mentioned the Nakba in school, a technician refused to put it on a PowerPoint because he said he looked it up in Wikipedia, and that's when the Arabs came out and killed the Jews. And this is what they're thinking. Last week in school, I had to break up an altercation between pupils. And I said, what's going on? And one of them said, well, it's terrible what's happening in Israel. I said, oh yes, it is. He said, yes, all these bombs going off from Hamas and killing the Israelis. I said, what are you talking about? And of course the other pupils came in, but they didn't have the full story. They couldn't articulate what was going on. And they asked me, well, what is it about, miss? And I said, it's about an ongoing, the longest in history of the present times, of an illegal military occupation. So the boy who started talking to me, and remember, all these are nice children, clever children. He said, but surely Israel has the right to defend itself, the killer line. And of course, this is what we have to contend with, because he hears this from the BBC, the the mouthpiece of the British government. He hears it from his parents, he hears it in schools. The BBC have been inundated, as you know, with messages, complaints against the coverage. They're not going to change their stance because they're the mouthpiece of the government. And the British government is hand in hand with the Israeli government selling them arms to disarm the Palestinians. One of our politicians 10 years ago, Liam Fox, came to Glasgow to give a speech. And his speech was, and the title is, Terrorism, Border Controls and the Palestinian Problem. Nicola Sturgeon and Humza Yousaf have recently given out statements condemning the violence against the Palestinians. But don't you worry, soon their voices of support will be muted as they will kowtow and their knuckles will be rapped in some way, and you will hear it dissipated in the matter of time. After all, they have signed up to the IHRA, which conflates anti-Semitism with support for Israel. Words and words and words. And whilst this genocide goes on, nothing happens. Nothing happens, and Palestinians are killed. So we have to, as a people, ask for sanctions, because that's the only way we'll stop Israel. We'll have to ask for sanctions and support for BDS. This is the only way. And maybe our politicians will be people of integrity and honour and speak up for the Palestinians. And as the truth spreads through social media and word of mouth, maybe one day the Nakba will be taught in schools, inshallah. Now, I've got a poem by Darin Tatur, is a Palestinian, a young Palestinian poet who's been imprisoned for writing this poem. Imprisoned for writing a poem. She is still in prison. And her book of poetry will come out at the end of May in Scotland, okay? Resist my people, resist them. In Jerusalem I dressed my wounds and breathed my sorrows and carried the soul in my palm for an Arab Palestine. I will not succumb to the peaceful solution. Never lower my flags until I evict them from my land. I cast them aside for a coming time. Resist my people, resist them. Resist the settlers' robbery and follow the caravan of martyrs. Shred the disgraceful constitution which imposed the degradation and humiliation and deterred us from restoring peace and restoring justice. They burned blameless children. As for Hadil, they sniped her in public, killed her in broad daylight. Resist, my people, resist. Darin Tatur, look her up, read the whole poem. Thank you very much for joining us and supporting us on Nakba.
Boycott Israel! Boycott Israel!